Hi, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Mr. Das. So, without much ado, because I've been told a good moderator is one who gets the author to speak the most. So, I've always wondered every time I see or read your CV, how did you combine these two hats? You are a very successful corporate head honcho and a writer, and you did both of them with aplomb.
Well, I think of life as not finding yourself, but creating yourself. And at each stage, circumstances happen that you just pull you in a certain direction. And each time you then have to seize the opportunity. So, for example, um, I went to the university planning to do something useful, according to my mother, and which was to become an engineer like my father. But I discovered there the humanities, and I discovered Sanskrit. And I mean, this was at Harvard, and I was doing Sanskrit at Harvard. I was reading Aristotle, and finally, I got my degree in philosophy. And 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 so I finished in philosophy. Then there was another moment. I had a scholarship to do a DPhil, a doctorate at Oxford in philosophy, and I was in Chandigarh, where my parents lived. In fact, Sector 9A is 71, Sector 9A. And what happened? I asked myself one day, lying down on the grass, did I want to spend the rest of my life at that stratosphere of abstract thought? And I said no. I said I wanted a life of action rather than thought. And so again, I sort of created myself. I joined the company, and then I joined the company. But I did something unusual, and that is that I didn't lose touch with the life of the mind. I became a weekend writer. So it was a weekend writer. I wrote a play when I was 22. I wrote another one at 20s. I wrote 3 plays in my 20s. And then I wrote a novel in my 30s, a novel actually which is set in Punjab, and called A Fine Family. And even my first play, Lawrence Saab, was set in Punjab about Henry Lawrence, the uh, who was the first Britisher who came to Punjab in the court after the death of Ranjit Singh. Anyway, my point is, and then at 50, or in my late 40s, I came to work one day, and I was at the world headquarters of PNG looking after strategic planning. And I was looking at the market share of our brands, Ariel and Tide and Pampers and all these good Vicks and Oil of Olay and all good brands. And I asked myself, how long can an adult come to work and do this again and again? And so that's what precipitated. I mean, it was a crisis of sorts, but I decided to quit. My wife was a good sport. She agreed, and we came back to India. And I set myself up as a writer, began writing a column in the Times of India and other papers. And so that's how it all was combined. I guess my point is that many parents think of when they're children, they think it's very important to make a living. And it is important to make a living. But one should always remember that one should also make a life. And so in making a life, you can think about many ways. It's about finding one's passion. But in fact, it's, Mozart at the age of 3. I mean, he knew he was a musical genius, but most of us are not like that. We kind of stumble onto our passions. But it's nothing wrong. Even at very late in age, you can find it. And, uh, and it is a source of happiness. I mean, The happiness is what? Happiness is simply to love the work you do and love the person you live with. So, in that one line definition, you can think about making a life and creating yourself at each stage.
So how did the trilogy come into being? I mean, did you plan for a trilogy, which I think is going to become a quartet now?
No, I didn't plan for it. It sort of moved from, you know, uh, book to book, in the sense that when I first came back to India, the reforms were beginning to take place. I was very worried that the left was trying to scuttle the reforms. They said we had sold out to the IMF, to the World Bank, to America. And and so the reforms needed to be defended. And that's what my early columns were about, defending the reforms. And in the process, I was asked by Nainan, you know, the formidable financial editor, to go around the country. And he said to tell us how the country has changed after the reforms. So this was midway. And Sudha Bharadarshan. And I my basic thought was how does a poor country become rich? And that's the theme of India Unbound, my first book. And that also happens to be on the first goal, the first Purushartha, which is Artha. And then, I mean, in that book, I predicted the rise of India. And I'm happy to say that India obliged by rising. And so, while prosperity was spreading in the country, middle class grew from 8% to 33%. 350 million people crossed the poverty line after 1991. And so we were on our way, and India had become the second fastest growing economy in the world. I still felt that there was a problem, and the problem was corruption. And so I thought I'd go to the Mahabharata, which is all about corruption, to find out about right and wrong, good and bad. And while I was trying to find a way to be good, I discovered the difficulty of being good. And that became the title of my next book. And so that's the second idea, moral well-being. And I'm not sure I got the answers there, but at least I've shown some ways to get there. And the third goal then was the goal of karma. And India is unique in elevating karma to a goal of life. Uh, and you know, the ancient the people, our ancients, thought about this, and they realized that desire, which is karma, is the source of all action. It's the source of creation. In the Rig Veda, the cosmos is born from desire in the seed of the mind of the one. And then, of course, there's the uh, desire is the basis of procreation and the continuance of the human race. So, very important. And that's when the third book called Karma, the Riddle of Desire, came into being. And, um, and the ancients even created a god named Kama. In fact, I think the sensible thing in India would be to change the name of Valentine's Day to Kama Deva Divas. And we'll take all the steam out of the Hindutvas in the process. So let's wait. February 14th. That's the date. Is it Valentine's Day or
Yeah.
something like that? We should celebrate Kama Day. Anyway, so this is how the trilogy came into being. And now I think with the fourth book, it's likely to become the trilogy is likely to become a quartet.
So tell
The
us a little,
fourth,
yeah, about the
go
fourth
ahead.
book.
Well, the fourth book, the fourth goal of life is moksha. And I always felt this was beyond me because I thought of moksha as a spiritual goal of liberation from birth and death, from the cycle of birth and death. Uh, and I'm an agnostic, but so I thought, this was not something that I could be writing about. Actually, the syncretic, and it was a mysticism where in our home he used to quote from Rumi, he used to quote from the Granths, he used to quote from Kabir and Mirabai and the various bhakti saints. And so in that very charged atmosphere, I had turned into an agnostic. Now, it's to my father's credit that he didn't push me in any direction. But while I was thinking about moksha, you go to the Monia Williams, the great Sanskrit dictionary, and you realize that the original meaning of moksha actually is freedom, liberation. It's like a horse without a harness. That's the symbol, that's the visual they gave. Or a pearl who is freed from the shell of the oyster. That's freedom. But even in our day-to-day life, we say we've discharged the debt and we say, bhai mukti ho gayi hai. And so it's a word that can be used in a secular sense. And mine then, our book, is a secular quest for moksha. It also coincides with the fact that Penguin, my publishers, for years have been asking me for an autobiography because booksellers have tell them that readers want to know how this guy has managed to wear two hats all his life and how did he manage to move from a business life to a writer's life, and so we want to know about it. And so I'm writing an autobiography, and the quest for moksha is a secular quest, and the secular quest in my case is very simple, and I think I'm not alone in suffering. I mean, the human bondage that we all experience um, from the fact that from day-to-day burdens, too much vanity, too much hypocrisy, too much envy, status anxiety, prejudice. All these are creations of our egos. And I think the idea of freeing yourself from the ego is also in the spiritual tradition, whether it's Shankara or whichever, Bhakti or whatever tradition you want. In the Upanishads, they are referring to this. And so a secular quest for moksha is a very reasonable project which I have undertaken.
And do you think moksha is every man can get a moksha?
Well, I think it's very difficult. I think that it's like the difficulty of being good. The reality is that the ego is very, very strong because we need the ego for survival. And it's really very rare. But there are people, and you've met them, and I've met them, people who are able to um, be, not so self-involved, to care for others, people who are considerate, they're kind people. Now, these are all liberations from that selfishness that our ego is programmed for. So we've met people like that. We've met people, um, and I think that's the quest. Now it's a work in progress, so I don't know where exactly it's going to end up. But I have an instinctive feeling that I'm onto something. I have a feeling that you can achieve quite a lot. And, even a book like the Kama Sutra, which is a book about love and desire and so on, uh, the, the things that it teaches the courtesan, it teaches the Nagaraka, the man about town, are things which are exactly in this way. For example, the Kama Sutra says, look, if you want to be socially successful, don't talk about yourself. Talk about the other person. Talk about her. If you want to seduce her, talk about her. And it says, don't speak in Sanskrit. You'll sound pompous. Speak in the language of the people. Now, this is very good advice because we all have a temptation to sound learned and pompous. We all have want to hold forth like those people on television, and news channels holding forth. So difficult to stop them. And so, I think that the fundamental issues, and frankly, I'm realizing that whether you're in the Buddhist tradition or the Hindu tradition or the Jain tradition or even the Christian tradition, you there is a desire in all these traditions for this kind of liberation. And that's the answers they give are all different. Some talk about God and some talk about Brahman and Atman and so on. But ultimately, I think this part of it, the diagnosis, is the same.
A decade ago, you returned to the topic of India rising, and you wrote a book called India Grows at Night, and where you said that Indians are doing well despite the state, not because of the state. So, is the present state more of a stumbling block or less of a stumbling block now?
Well, I'm afraid we are still there. I think India is still a bottom up success, unlike China, which is a top down success. The Chinese success was orchestrated by the state, by an amazing uh, uh, bureaucracy. Um, India uh, has, India really is, we should celebrate that we have risen almost despite the state. But we shouldn't celebrate because I think India, I said, India grows at night when the government sleeps. Well, India needs to grow during the day. And to grow during the day, we need to really do the governance reforms, the reforms of the police, the bureaucracy, the judiciary, and parliament. Um, for example, why should it take 15 years to get justice in the courts? That's ridiculous. This justice delayed is justice denied. Why should there be 3.5 million people who are waiting trial? Why should you and me, everyone is scared to go near a police station? You know, uh, why is the police the handmaiden of the chief minister? And these, in the case of the bureaucracy, why should one officer who's brilliant, who works hard and gets things done, works 12 hours a day, get promoted on the same day as another one who works 2 hours a day and does time pass because of the seniority system? You know, that's no organization should be run in that way, and how demoralizing is that? Uh, then, case of Parliament, why should we have 1 out of 4 members of Parliament with a criminal record? You know, um, so these are the what we need is, and it's not going to be easy because India has always been a weak state and a strong society, unlike China, which has been a strong state and a weak society. What you need is a strong state to get things done and a strong society to make that state accountable. And so our problem for both China and India actually is that unless we achieve this, India to improve its governance and China to improve its politics, both are going to get stuck in the middle income trap. Um, I really think that it's worthwhile dwelling on this China-India difference because, you know, historically, the Indian was defined by society, your by your village, your jati, your family. The Chinese was defined by the state. The Ours was a history of kingdoms. Chinese history was a history of empires. Um, the king in China, the emperor, gave the law and then he interpreted it. And he owned the property. In India, the ruler was the law, dharma, preceded the king. And it was the duty of the king to uphold dharma for the benefit of the people. So the reality is that we've always, and India's history was that of competing kingdoms. So I think in 1947, we could only have become a democracy. We can't be ruled with that iron hand. Uh, it's not. It's not our in the DNA. But what we can do is we can improve our governance. So, I mean, I think of India's history, contemporary history, in terms of 3 milestones. Of 3 milestones. First milestone was 1947, when, well, we got our independence, but we didn't get our full independence, only our political independence. Our economic independence came only 40 years later in 1991. And then now we are waiting for another liberation, which is the liberation from the state of governance that we have when India begins to grow during the day. So we are still waiting for it. And frankly, if I were to give advice to Mr. Modi, I would say focus on these 4 reforms: the judiciary, and they all, I mean, we know what has to be done. Reports have been written, the reform commissions have given, even the Supreme Court has, in the case of police reform, have said, you must do this, and it has not been done. So that is, I think, the unfinished business. And if Mr. Modi wants to go down in history, he'll go down in history if he does this far more than for other things that he's working on.
So you've seen India and Indians evolving over half a century. So, and of late, we've seen a lot of polarization. So, how do you explain that? And can you use again? Can you go back to mythology to explain the fissures or the divisions in our society, which suddenly seem very deep seated?
Yeah. Well, it's actually a global phenomenon, this polarization. Look at the United States. I mean, it is just as polarized as we are. And I think partly the polarization is due to the fact that, you know, there's been unfinished agenda in our country. we have, I mean, that's one of the things that in my book, in my next book, I'm trying to look at also the failures of our generation. And the failures of our generation, I think we have still not come to terms with partition. I think that we need to bring some sort of closure, and the brown Saabs just stepped into the shoes of the white Saabs without bothering to reform the colonial institutions and fashioning a new identity truer to the spirit of a free India. And the British sort of packed up and left in 1947, absent-mindedly leaving the English language. But that English language has given us it's been very positive, but it's also given us a headache because it's divided our country. I mean, just as we have divisions of caste and religion and regions and ethnic groups and the very important division is between those who are comfortable in English and those who are not. We've never done a full-fledged survey on this, but roughly about 15% of the people, I would say, at the most, would be comfortable. The trouble is this, that if you walk into a room and you don't, I mean, all the serious discussion in our country, whether it's in a boardroom, in business, or whether it is in politics or in the policy-making chambers of the government, they're in English. And the fact of the matter is that if you walk in and you don't understand English, you're deaf. Imagine being deaf in your own country. Now, this is a fault line. And the reality is, you're talking about Hindutva and the polarization there, but I think part of the origin is this, that there are people who are educated, bright people, but they never had the opportunity. And I think it's partly that resentment against, what is the resentment against the Khan Market gang or Lutyens Delhi? It's partly the resentment of those who got the chances to be educated and who are able to occupy places of leadership and policy making, and those who are not. So what Modi did was he brought, when he won in 2014, I mean, a lot of us were enthusiastic about it because he was promising Vikas, and a lot of people voted for him because he would bring jobs, people. But it was also this desire that Chaiwala's son has become the prime minister, and even I can aspire to higher office. The problem is that you need education, you need time. And so today you have this polarization between the secular elite on the one hand and people who are, I would say, they can't talk to each other. Partly it's a language problem. Now this is one way to think about it. There are other fault lines as well. When we have not been able to well, let me leave it at that. Let me leave it at that because it will become a much more complex anthropological kind of discussion.
All right.
And let's just leave it at that. I think if you ask me whether there's a fault lines in the epics. Well, the Mahabharata is full of polarization between the Kauravas and the Pandavas, and later, division between the Vaishnavas and non-Vaishnavas, because Krishna was first just basically a friend of the Pandavas in early times. Later, he became a Kul Devta, and then he became the God, the Krishna Dev, which was Vishnu's um, incarnation. And so you have that, you have the Brahmins, the fault line, because the Brigu Brahmins, the Bhargavas, had rewrote the Mahabharata also, and that became somewhat of a caste fault line. I would say that this problem is a very real one. My own view is that India's basic DNA is syncretic, it is tolerant. In a country where you have 330 million gods, no god can afford to feel jealous. So I personally think this whole Hindutva project is pushing water uphill, because the average woman or man who goes to a temple doesn't think in that way. Now, you can keep repeating a message and make people behave in a certain way, but it's not in our DNA. And I think, frankly, people will ultimately. I mean, the Bihar's latest election, the story was not the BJP victory. The story was Tejasvi's promise of jobs. And I think that we may be turning back to the right way of, doing politics and keeping religion out of it.
And do you have high hopes from our demographic dividend, the fact that a large chunk of our population is below 20, below 30?
Well, I lost all my friends on the left when I wrote a column called Vote for the Demographic Dividend in 2014, because, frankly, sorry, I'll just put my phone on silent. Um, Frankly, um, I, like many people, was sick and tired of the corruption in the Congress party. We were not getting anywhere. So many projects were stalled, and it was really very, very moan, looking for somebody else. And I thought Modi could provide that demographic dividend. Well, he has not. He has not. You have to do the reforms. He has recently done some good reforms in agriculture and the labor code, etc. But you need much more. We need much more. And you need to have an export orientation. Our exports have been stagnant. So if we want to create a demographic dividend, a demographic dividend people expect is not jobs like the Pakorawala jobs. You want decent jobs. That's what we elected Modi in 2014 for. And I mean, he gave us demonetization, and that was the wrong thing to do. So, I mean, everybody can make a mistake, but the reality is that we have not. So, I'm not optimistic today, but Manraj, the the basic fundamentals of our economy are still strong, and there are opportunities. Oil prices are down right now, and we have food self-sufficiency. We can be a major food exporter. We are already a major food exporter. We just have to get. I think these agricultural reforms are going to help in there. I'm still optimistic that if we just focus on the right things, and we know what they are, what reforms more that need to be done, and I mean, I would reverse this present day this sort of protectionism that has come in. I would join RCEP. And we so what I'm trying to say is, yes, we have the opportunity once the COVID we get over it. we have the opportunity. And I just think it's going to be more difficult to get the demographic dividend. Right now, it looks pretty disastrous, that situation.
So now I think we have very less time left. So my favorite question to you, your tips for a writer, for a budding writer, since you've been such a successful one yourself?
Well, the beginning point really is to show up. Woody Allen said the secret of success, 80% of success is to show up. Meaning that I am at my desk here in this room, in this study, at by 6 in the morning, every day, 24, every day of the year. I write from 6 till about 12:30. And even if I'm not, even if it's not going too well, I'm still there. I still show up, and I still try to write. And so I think really it is partly it is sweat, you know. Talent is one thing, but a lot is a discipline, uh, and frankly, um, that would be my advice to the writer. And even when I was a weekend writer, I was a weekend writer for 25 years, and I became a full-time writer for the next 25 years. So in these 50 years, even the weekends, I used to write at this schedule. And so you keep improving, you keep writing. I think my new book, I'm discovering a new light way. I've discovered, frankly, that the the best way to live as I relive my life. In fact, reliving, what's nice about writing an autobiography is that you relive your life. And reliving your life is better than living it. It's like remembering an event is maybe superior to the event itself. And so in reliving my life, I find the best moments of my life is when I was light, when I was living lightly. And living lightly means you take your work seriously, but you take yourself lightly. You take your work, you take your you take your work. In other words, don't take yourself too seriously. Take away the burden of the kind of things that the ego brings forth. And I think it's an idea, actually. Patanjali talks about it in the Yoga Sutras. One of the siddhis is Lakima, in Lakima. And Lakima means lightness. And they, of course, describing the physical idea of the body being able to rise and levitate and all that. But it's one of the perfections. But I also think of it as the way to live, as the way to live. Don't take yourself too seriously. And so that's what I would tell anybody, laugh a lot. That's what I would say.
Thank you so much, Mr. Das.
Sorry, let me just say, live lightly, not like a feather, that lightness, or a ball of cotton, but like a bird. A bird has agency.
It's
So
lovely. That is such a lovely way of putting it. Very poetic.
Thank you.
And if I may, you said you earlier in the beginning you said your idea of happiness. So what is happiness? What would you say is happiness?
Well, as I said, you know, loving the work you do and loving the person you live with is my
Very
one
simple.
definition. But the second part, from the Purusharthas, I have learned that these are potentialities in us. Artha, Dharma, Kama, Moksha. They're potentials in us. and fulfilling that potential, achieving those capabilities that we have, is also a source of happiness. The problem, of course, is that many of these goals of life, they conflict often, such as karma and dharma. They often conflict, because karma is a duty to yourself, dharma is a duty to you, to another person. So this is a constant conflict in our lives. I've in the middle of desire, I have a whole, this is one of the recurring themes of that book, the karma versus dharma.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, sir. On this note, we'll thank you so much for a most enlightening discussion. I'm sure I'll go back to that to hear it again and again, to listen to it again and again. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure having you here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.